Hi, I'm Randolph Miller, and welcome to another segment of Bounce Around Charleston. Well, with me today in Black History Month, we have the Mr. Historian himself, Professor Damon Fordham, and we're happy to have him on Bounce Around Charleston. Welcome again, Professor Fordham, to Bounce Around Charleston.
I'm always happy to be here.
Okay, let's get started. We're in another Black History Month. Why don't you tell our viewers how this whole thing got started?
Definitely. There was a man up in Kentucky by the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson.
Mhm.
Dr. Woodson's parents were in slavery, and he was born in 1875, 10 years after slavery ended. And he attended Berea College in Kentucky after years of working in coal mines. And he went on to be one of the first African Americans to get his PhD from Harvard. Well, in his day, he lived to see a lot of segregation and the period of lynching and so forth. And so, being an educated man, he saw the gap between the educated and the uneducated on a whole lot of issues. And he felt that a lot of the reason that people were discriminating against Black people in those days was because of their lack of knowledge of the reality of the Black situation, allowed them to do the bidding of people who bid African Americans ill will. So he also wanted to introduce a lot of pride and self-respect into African American children, which was necessary because oftentimes if your parents are in despair and misery over their conditions, they're going to pass on to the children a diet of despair, which helps to cripple their future. So he decided to use the birth dates of Abraham Lincoln and the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass to start Negro History Week in 1926. And 50 years later, in 1976, that became Black History Month.
Wow, so it was first known as Negro History Month.
Negro History Week.
Negro History Week.
Right, until 1976.
And then it became Black History Month.
Yes, sir.
Wow. So what you're telling us, he decided that we needed to do this so we could educate people about the history of African Americans.
Yes, and that's still widely needed today because, as you know, there are efforts in this country to put a stop to that type of teaching within our schools in many areas. Plus, a lot of young people still don't know about a lot of these things that have been accomplished by African Americans, and many people still believe the negative myths, such as the idea that Black History Month was, quote, given to Black people because it's the coldest and shortest month. Well, that's barbershop talk, and that's not reality. The reality is based on my research, what I just told you regarding Dr. Woodson. So a lot of these things are still necessary because our youth still need to have some positivity instilled with them, because it's only through planting those seeds that those seeds will blossom into productive trees that will create a better future.
Tell me something, Professor Fordham. What are some of the things that we see normally every day that people don't know was created by African Americans?
Well, I'll tell you the biggest thing that they don't know was created by African Americans is the South Carolina public school system. And let me explain what I mean by that. You see, many people have heard about Robert Smalls, who was the enslaved man who freed himself and his family from slavery by stowing away on the Confederate ship called the Planter and off into Charleston Harbor and into freedom. But after slavery, there was a period called Reconstruction, when you had the federal government trying to pass laws that made African American citizens. So 76 Blacks and 48 whites gathered at the Charleston Clubhouse, which is now the J. Waties Waring Federal Courthouse on Meeting Street. And they rewrote the Constitution of South Carolina to make it more progressive. And one of the things, Robert Smalls, on January 23rd, 1868, got up and proposed that all children between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. And that was the foundation of the public school system in South Carolina.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm quite sure a lot of people did not know that, sir.
Well, they wouldn't know that because, you see, I found that myself by looking in the records of the 1868 Constitutional Convention at the Charleston County Public Library in the South Carolina Room Archives. And that's why I think that it's important for scholars who know these things to have forums where the average Jane and the average Joe can get that kind of information to begin with. And that's what I try to do.
If you had to recommend books for us to read, what would be some of the books? I see you smiling.
Well, as you know, I've written a few myself, including True Stories of Black South Carolina and Voices of Black South Carolina that deal with these very facts. The book that got me started on this was Langston Hughes' Pictorial History of the Negro in America, which was written over 50 years ago, but it's still pretty relevant. You can find it in libraries. And Dr. Henry Louis Gates, a man who I'm proud to call a friend and mentor of mine, he has a number of wonderful documentaries on the subject that you can find on YouTube as well as on the PBS website. And he wrote a book called Stony the Road, which is an excellent compilation of this type of history for young people to read.
Okay, so are there any particular things going on this month that we should be engaged in?
Well, there are programs all over the place that you can find on Facebook. I'm still being asked to do things here and there. And if anyone wishes for me to participate in such things, my email address is Damon Fordham, that's DAMON FORDHAM 1964, as in the year 1964 when I was born, at gmail.com. I am also on Facebook, and I have a YouTube channel called The American Storyteller, where people can learn a lot of interesting facts and stories of this kind.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, tell me something. What are some of the products that we use that we can say that were founded by African Americans?
Well, a number of things. For example, there was ice cream, of course. And as a matter of fact, in my book, True Stories of Black South Carolina, I found there was a list done in the 1890s by George Washington Murray. He was a Black politician in Sumter, South Carolina area and a relative of Congressman James Clyburn. He wrote a list of things that African Americans had patented, including improvements on tractors and such that he invented himself, as well as Jan Metzlinger with the shoe lasting machine, among other things. And of course, there's the often story about George Washington's Carver and the Peanuts, but I will tell you this about Carver. Did you know that Carver had a bus called the Booker T. Washington School on Wheels, that when he was not teaching science at Tuskegee, he drove throughout Alabama teaching illiterate farmers how to plant properly?
Wow. And we keep seeing stories about the Tuskegee Airmen and all that they contributed. What about that?
Well, the Tuskegee Airmen, during World War II, there was a belief that African Americans were too uneducated to fly planes, which again goes back to the reason that Carter G. Woodson started Black History Month in the first place, in order to educate people to that fact. These men were trained at the Tuskegee Airfield, which I had the honor of visiting in 1998, in order to fly. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who at that time was the First Lady of the United States, bravely got on a plane with one of these Black men to show that Black men could fly planes to serve in the World War II effort. And many of these men flew in plane missions where they guarded white pilots while they were fighting against the Nazis.
Wow. So basically what you're telling us here today, that there's true history that can be contributed to the African Americans.
Well, Malcolm X said it best in a speech that he gave in Los Angeles on October the 5th, 1962, when he told people that you could never do anything unless you know that you have done something. And there's still so many of our young people who are growing up surrounded by negativity and bitterness, to where we have to understand that there's power in the tongue. And if the parents don't have the education to know these things, they can take the young people to the library, and the librarians could recommend age-appropriate books for these children to read so they could prove their defense against things like that. But one thing I would caution people about is be careful about the internet, because you have a lot of misinformation that's out there on the internet. And the last thing our young people need is to go to school and say something ridiculous, such as that this idea that a Black man named John Henson was supposed to be president before George Washington. That's nonsense. You can't be president of a country where you can't even vote to begin with. And they don't need to go to school repeating nonsense like that. So it's important that the parent take the child to the library so that they could get real books by real scholars and thus get real facts.
Okay, well, Mr. Professor Damon Fordham, we want to tell you thank you so much for this historical knowledge today that you have given us on Black History Month. It's always great to have you on Bounce Around Charleston.
It's always a pleasure to be here, and I'd be happy to come back on other future occasions.
Thank you, sir. Okay, you heard it right here on Bounce Around Charleston, how Black History Month got started. Well, first, he told us it was a week, and then it became a month. Thank you, Professor Damon Fordham. We'll be right back after this break.